This show talks about books that feature mental health and mental illness topics. There are many books that include this topic, and my hope is that more and more people know about them because they help to decrease the stigma and help people not feel so alone in their struggle. I am your host, Robin Tamanaha, licensed marriage and family therapist. Joining me on this episode is my guest, Dara Hoffman-Fox. Dara wrote the book You and Your Gender Identity, A Guide to Discovery. Hi, Dara.
Hi, Robin.
Hi, thanks for being my guest today.
Thank you so much for having me on your show today.
Yeah. So I like my guests to briefly, introduce themselves. Is there a few things you'd like to say about yourself, such as who you are and what you do, so the listeners can know?
Sure, I'd be glad to introduce myself. So my name's Dara, and I live in Colorado. I have a mental health counseling private practice in the town of Colorado Springs, which is where I also live. And I am a licensed professional counselor. I've had my private practice, we're going on year 12 right now. And it's kind of over through the course of time that I have landed in a place in which my area of expertise is in working with those who are gender questioning, as well as those who already have established for themselves the awareness that they are transgender or non-binary. And so I also see other clients, people ask me that all the time, but a really large percentage of the folks I see, I would say that they're part of that population because there still is a limited number of therapists who do work on that higher level of needing to be able to help them to the extent that they need to be able to be helped, to be able to fully, if they choose, decide to transition, or even if they decide not to transition, how to emotionally help them through that process. And so in Colorado Springs, I do, over the years, there has been more and more folks who are therapists who are learning how to work with this community. But yeah, this is something that it started off as a professional interest, and perhaps we'll talk more about this as well. But through the process, I'm sure this has happened to others, but sometimes you don't know quite why you're involved with something, or you have certain people in your life, and then you realize, oh, that's because this is me. I realized myself that I'm non-binary when I was 40. I'm about to turn 46, so this would have been about 6 years ago. And it was through the help of working with non-binary teenagers and going to a conference in which I learned what it meant to be non-binary that I suddenly was like, oh, there's a lot that I now is making a lot more sense as to why I'm connecting so much with this community.
Yeah. And that is so wonderful, because this is, especially for your clients, it's definitely like a specialty, and that's so great that they have you as like a resource and a therapist, and thank you also for sharing like your kind of journey in a way, when it came to, like you said, it's funny what we gravitate towards or what we become interested in as therapists. There's like something inside. Did that also influence the book too, or?
Good question. And I didn't realize it until I started writing the book. Yeah. And sometimes, the timing of it all kind of mushes together. But the writing of the book, I remember it started when I would receive a lot of email. And the reason a lot of people knew my email address is because I had a blog, and I also have a YouTube channel. And, I'm like, hey, email me. And I didn't realize I would get sometimes dozens a day of emails from folks. And the highest majority of those emails are from people who are saying, hey, can you help me figure out, am I transgender? Am I non-binary? What's going on with me? And, because I already had a full client load and there's just only so much you can do. I remember feeling frustrated that there wasn't a resource out there for them. And so as many of us do, we create what we want to see in the world. Like, I know I need this resource for my clients, so I knew I need to write a book. I thought at first it would be this little 20-page PDF, which is really silly. So, because it turned out to be an almost 300-page book. But then in the process of doing that, I knew at that point that there was more to myself to figure out. So definitely as I was writing the book, it turned out to be really cool that it turned out the questions I was writing and the different chapters I was putting together, I was able to answer them myself. And by the time I finished the book, I knew for sure I was non-binary.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really neat. And I have your book and I read it and it's absolutely wonderful.
Thanks, Robin.
Yeah. And I see what you mean because, like you said, as you were writing it or going through it, like it's cool because throughout the book, there's a lot of these like reflections and like exercises or prompts in a way to really think about things. So that's really cool that like you were also doing that as well.
Right. Yeah. And I have to admit, I mean, I'm the kind of person where I like workbooks. I like to have prompts and things like that to
Mm-hmm.
work through. And so, sure, people who connect with this type of approach will probably enjoy it a lot, and because it's put together in that fashion. It can also be read and, you don't have to answer the questions. You can just read the information that's in there and sit and think about it, or however else is comfortable for a person to be able to process and work through these things.
Definitely, definitely. That's a good point. Yeah. So would you be okay with maybe sharing, a little more? I'm kind of curious, about your also, personal journey.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I'd love to. So I was born in the 1970s. And so this was a time where either being queer, gay, trans in any sorts, definitely not on anyone's radar, or if it was, it would have been in a fairly negative way. I was born in Philadelphia, and but just my parents had no idea, and neither did the doctors, that they should not have gendered me as female at birth, even though by all appearances of our external genitalia we are assigned our gender right away, sometimes even before birth, we're assigned our gender if you're able to see through an ultrasound. And so, additionally, besides the fact that I grew up not knowing that I was non binary, I also did not know that I was gay. And it's interesting, I use the word gay because gay, technically means attracted to the same sex. Well, anyway, in this case, I'm non-binary, but as I was growing up female, thinking I was female, I then knew that I was attracted to, when I was young, I was attracted to girls, and as I got older, to women. So that took me until a very messy journey as it can be. But by the time I was 30, I realized that it was time for me to admit to myself and to others that I was gay. And so at the time I was married and I got divorced. We had a daughter together who's now 19 years old, who I'm very grateful to have her. You never know why
Mm-hmm.
you're meant to go through things. And for sure, I needed to have her in my life.
Mm-hmm.
And then it was another 10 years until the non-binary part came up because, even though I was 30 years old, I thought I had it all figured out at the time. Yeah, okay, great. I've known all along. I'm a lesbian. This is what's been
Mm-hmm.
going on. Not having any idea there was also a gender component beneath that. So at the time, I also that's when I went to graduate school and started pursuing my degree in counseling. And once I finished that, I worked for our local Pride Center, and that's how I really started getting connected with the local LGBT community. That's where I met the first people, as far as I knew, who were transgender. It's one area I remember saying to my boss, like, I've never met anybody transgender. And so this was like the mid 2000s. And so that was a great learning experience and very important for me because once I started my own private practice shortly after I left the Pride Center, I was the only person in town, the only therapist in town who was working with transgender clients. And so I had a lot to learn, even though I was the only person which is really sad to say, who was like even at least open and willing and supportive of the community. So it was over the course of those years that I realized that this was a community I really cared for and wanted to help. And then eventually, just because I enjoy media and I enjoy writing, is when I started to create a blog and then a YouTube channel and then a Facebook page and started doing interviews. And that's where things really started to feel really exciting because I felt like I clicked in on my life purpose, or at least one of my life purposes, to be able to do as much as I can to really advocate for and educate those who don't know a lot about this when it comes to being transgender and non-binary.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. And that's so cool to hear, like just the whole process and like that whole journey just kind of evolve like over time. That's so interesting. That's really neat.
Yeah, I've noticed it really helps, especially people who are younger, who are still trying to figure this out, to know like, wow, it seems like you really got it together. Like,
Mm,
your stuff. And I'm like, let me tell you, like, when I was your age, here's what I didn't know. You're even ahead of me where I was at, at your age. So that's really, I think it's really important, and I don't know if any of your listeners that's helpful to them to know that it really can take a long time. It might not take you until you're 40 because you know about this now when you're younger than I did. So my hope is that, especially if you need a book like this, that this is something that could be able to have that process happen, and at least the awareness can happen a little sooner in your life.
Definitely. Yeah. So let's delve into, the book as well. I see in the title, it's discovery, the word discovery, and as I read the book and as I was going through that, it very much did feel like a journey in a way, getting to know yourself, past experiences, current, how you felt about things, when you're younger and now, so what could like maybe the reader expect, or maybe some options as far as like an outcome of like going through the book, or like kind of what are you hoping, or, that the readers kind of have as far as their experience or maybe possible takeaways from the book? Does that kind of make sense?
It does,
Okay.
absolutely. Yeah, as I wrote the book, I really realized just how much I really connect with that notion of life being a journey. And then, it's cliche and it's overused a bit, but there's specifically Joseph Campbell and his creation of the hero's journey, which is largely based on the work of Carl Jung, who's also one of my favorite psychoanalysts. And so that to me felt like I need to have a structure for this book, especially because this book sometimes is going to be read by people who they don't have access to a therapist. And so I want to make sure it's almost as if they have what would I as a therapist want them to know. And that's why it was really important for me to make sure, even, I break it up into 3 stages, that the first stage is really about preparation for this journey. It's going to be painful just to jump right in and not be prepared for it. And so the reader can expect, and of course the reader can jump around the book if they already have done all this. But, in terms of preparation, I'm talking about making sure you have a support system ready. If you don't have one yet, I give ideas as to how you can form your own support system. I talk about how important it is to understand what fears you have when it comes to being able to try to get to your truth, because your fears are sitting in between you and that truth, that answer you want to get. And I explain a lot about how you need to get to know your fears. Just trying to push them away, they're only going to keep coming back. And so there's a lot about that. And then we move into a stage of making sure that you take time to reflect. And so there's so much information, depending on the age of the person who's reading the book, that you can gain from looking back on your childhood or your teenage years if you look at it through the lens of asking yourself questions about your gender. I also want to pause for a second because I want to reiterate, because I've heard this has been really helpful for readers, is that a lot of times, somebody is asking the question, am I transgender? And I ask them to actually take a step back and ask themselves, do I feel like I align with my assigned gender at birth? And so somebody is assigned female at birth or someone's assigned male at birth. And just to ask yourself, do I feel like that is actually my gender? And if somebody answers no, or even maybe, then that means go ahead and start reading the book. See if you can get closer to your answer. Trying to go for the answer right away, am I transgender, is really daunting. There's so many different layers to it. And so just even feeling valid in the sense of knowing, I think there's a good chance I don't feel aligned with my gender assigned at birth. That gives you permission to go ahead and start exploring. Again, it's a journey. It's something that a lot of people feel like they need permission to feel like they are even allowed to even begin this journey. So I feel like that question could be something important for folks to keep in mind.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up and that you asked it in that way, because even just the way like that question is, it's a lot more kind of open, because I could see how someone may have that initial thought right off the bat, like, am I transgender? However, so there are so many layers. And even as I was going through the book, like even when I would sit there and I would kind of reflect on some of the questions and prompts, like there were more layers to what I was to what
Mm.
I was thinking about. It
Mm-hmm.
kind of went on in all different branches. So it's a lot more complex,
Nice.
you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah, exactly. I'm glad you had that experience. It's true. I've heard that from a lot of people who've read it. Yeah, and so the third part of the book has to do with exploration, and so the reader can expect that there's going to be a lot of very actionable steps that they can take to start exploring. And I also make sure I set these parameters in terms of safety and risk, because that's really important to keep in mind. For a lot of folks, it's going to be higher risk for some people than others to be able to start doing this exploration. So
Mm.
there's a lot of that that's talked about to kind of help a person be able to, even if they need to dip a toe into something to test it out, to try to
Yeah.
give them the awareness as to how they can do that. That reminds me that I also make sure I include a lot of prompts for people to pause and do self-care, either before or after, or sometimes both before and after an exercise, because some of this is really intense in terms of the work that you'll be doing as a reader. And so it's important. I talk at the beginning of the book about self-care and give a lot of ideas about what you can have on your list of go-to self-care items.
That's great, that self-care aspect, because it's interesting, and we know this too as therapists, like just sometimes processing things and kind of thinking about stuff, it brings up a lot, you know? And so it is so important to still almost do the self-care things as like just practice or like habit, and it's a good way to like take care of oneself, you know, especially when thinking about these, you know, different things. And I could imagine even then too, like you mentioned, you know, for some it maybe more risky, there's more risk than others. So I could imagine, you know, I can't even imagine like how much that would bring up, you know, just
Mm-hmm.
like on like a mental, like, you know, emotional level as well.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah. So question, thank you for going through all the different, you know, components and breaking down the book. That was really great. So my question, one of the questions, I was going to ask is, so this whole pandemic, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it's, you know, I've been talking a lot about this with each guest that I've had on since like March, because it's encompassed everyone in, you know, daily life, and just really, influenced and changed just kind of the way we go about things, right? So as far as your book, you know, whether it's like the self-care or like resources or suggestions, you know, given the pandemic, right? You know, and the suggestions in your book, are there some that maybe like more easier than others now given the pandemic, or maybe ones that may be a little more challenging than others?
Yeah, I've been thinking about that a lot too. I've been toying around with the idea of doing a revised edition of the book, and my publisher was interested in it. And then I paused that process because I was like, we need to give this at least a year and see what
Mm-hmm.
is life going to be like. Any suggestions I offer in the book that have to do with being able to find resources, especially online, I feel like those are going to be ones that are going to be even more highlighted. So that would include being able to find people to connect with who you can actually engage with, who are trans or non-binary, or, you know, especially if you want to find somebody who is like close to your age or who looks like you. I think that's going to be even there's going to be even more opportunity for that the more that we're online. I'm also hoping that, you know, because some of my suggestions have been maybe you can attend a conference or something like that and meet other people. Well, I think even after things quote unquote go back to normal, more conferences are going to be online, which makes them more
Mm-hmm.
accessible
Yeah.
to people when it comes to, you know, financially being able to travel, somebody just in terms of their ability to be able to, you know, go to a conference in person on all the different levels. My feeling is that that's going to change for sure. Yeah, anything that has to do with finding role models online, being able to like attend their, you know, they might be just having like video chats or whatever it might be. So I feel like that's the kind of stuff that's going to become even better in the
Mm-hmm.
future. I mentioned something about like going to conferences, also going to support groups, being able to meet people in person, at least for right now, that is going to be a lot tougher. And that can be really hard for a lot of people. Not everybody is able, for many different reasons, to be able to either use the internet or feel comfortable using video. It can be really hard for someone, especially if they're in that process of figuring out things about their gender identity, and having to see themselves on camera for extended amounts of time can be even painful and at the very least uncomfortable. So I can see where, until we're able to gather together again in ways that can be safe, that's going to be a part of the book that those ideas need to be put on pause.
Got it. Yeah. And you bring up really good points, and what you mentioned about even like virtual things, it's interesting because now I think even given the pandemic, there's been almost like an influx of like webinars and like Zoom calls and all these things, almost even those that may not have really, like organizations and stuff that may not have done them so much before. It's interesting with the pandemic how, in some ways there have been like a lot more use of technology, but given even what you said about like them seeing themselves on camera, right, and on video,
Right.
like I never would have thought about that, but that's like that makes so much sense.
Sure. Yeah, and
Yeah.
so being able to have options where it could be, like if you choose to turn your video off, you can certainly join us by audio, or you can join in on the chat. Like I feel like that, the fact that people are getting used to it. I'm getting used to it. I'm getting used to doing therapy online now. I'm getting used to giving trainings online, and to a certain extent, I feel like this is not going to stop. And I like how it makes it where people are more able to join in. So I think we have some lengths to go in terms of figuring out how can we still make this even more comfortable for those, for instance, like you said, who really have difficulty being able to have to look at that self that they are literally struggling with every moment, and then having to just stare at that picture in the meantime. I bet there will be solutions that come up for that. And I think it's going to be really important.
Definitely. And I hope too that even just like this is good, in that even your book for those as well, because, thinking about that and what that component, must be like for someone would definitely help, I think too, when it comes to thinking about how it's formatted, something like that, something virtual, being able to kind of know what may be going on and, internally for someone so that they can also have all these different types of options, such as like, just joining by audio, if it's, not super comfortable right now to join by video,
Right.
So I think, yeah.
Yeah, I was even imagining like it would be kind of cool if like, and I know this can happen sometimes, you could just have an avatar that you've created or a Bitmoji or something like that, that more so indicates with accuracy how you feel inside. And it would be, wouldn't be the same as having your video up, but at least there'd be a picture of yourself that's up, but it'd be through your own creation of being able to have that out there.
Yeah. Or maybe like their like Animal Crossing character.
Yes, I bet a lot of people would love that too.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah. So it sounds like there's some parts of the book that will be kind of a to be continued. Just kind of given the pandemic, and everything. Is there anything that you want to talk about, such as like any other like specific populations, whether we have or haven't brought them up so far, or that is or isn't in the book so far, that you want to discuss?
I will say that definitely, over the past few weeks, I have been thinking about how if I do revise the book, it definitely needs to be run through, I would even say maybe a committee of folks who are people of color, because I do know when I look back in retrospect, even though I had a committee of people who read my book beforehand to give me their impressions of what they thought, there was only one person of color, I think probably out of maybe 8. And I feel like that is not okay. And I have a sense that in the book, there's nothing maybe obvious that is like indicating that I wasn't paying attention to that. But I absolutely know there are things missing from the book. I know that when I think back on it, I know I did talk in the book about, socioeconomics, if you're not able to afford such and such or such and such. Here are some options. I mentioned that like as you're growing up, maybe you didn't know that you were transgender because of maybe you were brought up under a religion that said it wasn't okay, or maybe your culture or your race, it's not okay. But very brief mention of it. And I feel like there's so much that I am, yes, I've been having to admit that I know that there's definitely aspects of the book and the trainings that I do as well that I need to revisit and revise to make sure that people of color feel like they're truly being represented. The cover of the book was something I was very aware of about how do I make this cover of a book having to do with gender identity be all inclusive? And in the end, there's like an eyeball on the cover. Then the iris is purple, that's, just so it can kind of include all of the different varieties. But I do remember, a couple of folks were like, well, that doesn't look like an eyeball of somebody who's Black. It could be somebody who's white and I remember knowing and feeling uncomfortable, like, oh no, like I really want to make sure everybody feels welcome by this book. So I think there's a lot more to think about when it comes to that.
Yeah. And that's great. I'm looking forward to that. Like, too, those other components, maybe even like, when it comes to like culture and stuff. I'll share with you, something that was like really interesting. Cause like, as I said, like I, did go through and like read, some of the questions and it was so I'm Japanese, right? So I'm Japanese American. And it was so interesting when I was reading, especially the early, like reflecting back on like your childhood when you're younger. So like, and I'm a kid of the 80s too. That's when I was born. So, when I was going through those reflections, I was thinking about like, even things were so like gendered, like, and just, pink, blue, like toys, it was so, and especially even with like the media, I remember that, like the commercials, what were boys, quote unquote, boys toys, quote unquote, girls toys,
Right.
and that was like so much of a push, so I was like, oh, I remember that, and growing up, like I wasn't always like aware of it. I am now, because I think we've come a little bit, when it comes to that, and putting people in boxes in that way. But then too, I also like reflected on like my culture and like what that was like. And my family, one side of my family is very traditional Japanese. And, thinking about that component in Japanese, it is very gendered, and also the language. It was so interesting because even the word like I or me, there's a quote unquote masculine way of saying it and quote unquote feminine way of saying it. So because I'm a woman, I can only say that word a certain way, not the way the men do, So it was like, and so I remember just sitting there like, whoa.
Wow, yeah,
because it is like literally ingrained into the language of my culture. And I was like, whoa, like it was, I don't know. I just kept saying wow, like to myself the whole day because I just sat with that. But I will say even just through the prompts, like that's when I mentioned earlier, like one question or one thing that I thought of kind of branched out into like all these other layers and pieces. It was one of it was that experience. And it was a really cool experience to have because it wasn't until like, we sit down and we really think about these things and how like just generationally, culturally, where you live, the generation you grew up, like how it's so much influences things. Really interesting.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that with me. I can already see how that I can expand upon that and like actually, let it be known. Like, so for instance, this is something that can be really relevant, depending on the culture you grew up in. And yeah, I think that'd be an entire chapter should be written about that.
I think there'd be so much like cool information, and so many like cool prompts. So all in all, I'm very excited about that.
Thank you. Yeah, it sounds like you would be instrumental in if there is a revision of the book written, then I'm sorry. I'm now going to make sure you're on the list.
Hey, that's fine with
I've
me.
assigned you.
Yeah, I'd love to
have your help.
Yeah. So, well, we are just about out of time. Before we end though, like, is there anything else like you wanted to share, like let the listeners know about?
I know perhaps there's like different types of folks who are listening to this. And so if you are someone who you yourself feel like this is a book that could be of help. I did want to mention that I have it on my YouTube channel. I've started reading from the book. It was kind of like my pandemic idea, like what's something different I can do during this time to kind of give back. And so I've only gotten through the introduction, and I'm about to upload the self-care part. So it's going to take me a bit, but you could always get the book ahead of time, and then I've heard a lot of people in the comments have said, oh, this is really fun. I can go back and like read along with you.
Wow.
But I also wanted to mention anybody who perhaps is a mental health professional. And if you're interested in getting this book, I've had a lot of therapists tell me that for one, this has been helpful for them just to read, to understand better what their clients are going through. You also can use the exercises that are in the book with your clients as prompts and have them do some homework and come back again. This is especially good for therapists who really want to work with this population, but are sort of, a little nervous about it and not sure where to start. You can use this guide as a guide of sorts to be able to take you through that process.
Yeah, great. Well, again, Dara, thanks so much for being here today. I can see how the book would be so helpful for so many and also empowering. Where can the listeners find your book?
Sure, a couple of options. The URL that you can buy it directly from me is discoveryourgenderidentity.com. And there's a coupon code I'll give you for 10% off. You can just type in YouTube and that'll give you 10% off the book. If you order it directly through me, I will sign the book, and then you'll also get a free copy of the PDF of the book right away. As soon as you buy the book, you can download the PDF. It also makes it a little bit easier, like if you wanted to print off some of the pages and fill it out for exercises, or even share them with your client, you can do that, and then you'll receive the hard copy of the book. I do know that obviously for those, especially if finances are an issue, you can go to a place like Amazon or barnesandnoble.com and be able to purchase the book there. And I'm sure there's used copies on there that would be for less cost. And for those who are international, that's a huge cost to be able to pay the shipping if you bought it directly from me. So by all means, use the other methods. You can always even contact a local bookstore and ask them to order it for you. And then that way they have to take care of the shipping and all of that. And you could just pick it up from them.
That's a great idea. Yeah. And if our listeners are interested in finding out more about you, where could they do that? Do you have like a separate website, or just would it also be the website you just mentioned?
You can go to darahoffmanfox.com, and there is where, when I used to be writing for my blog, I have all of my blog posts on there since I think it started like 2013. I have links to my YouTube channel, and I have all the podcast interviews I've ever done are also listed there. So those have been, at this point, there's probably at least probably over 100 since the mid 2000 teens. And so, yeah, that is a huge hub of information that can be found at darahoffmanfox.com.
Cool. And what I'll do is I'll also post all the information you said, including this episode as well, on our podcast website, which is booksbetweensessions.com. Well,
Great.
Thank you so much, Dara, for doing this episode.
Thank you, Robin. I really appreciate having this platform to be able to share all of this on.
Yeah. All right. Well, take care.
You too. Bye.
Bye. Thanks for listening. Hopefully this was informative or helpful. The information of today's guest and their book can be found at the podcast website, booksbetweensessions.com. If you have any book suggestions or books you would like discussed on this podcast, please send us a message on the contact page of the podcast website. And if you're an author who has written a book that includes mental health or mental illness topics, and you would like to be on this podcast, please contact us through the contact page of the podcast website, booksbetweensessions.com. Also, this podcast is not psychotherapy or counseling. If you need to speak with a professional, you should find one local to you and contact them directly. If this is an emergency, please call your local emergency number or go to your nearest emergency department.